clapped in irons, and stigmatized with the brand of slavery, which was accordingly done, for they were all burnt who did not escape with the king's mark. I myself saw the impression made on the son of the chiefest person in the city. Those that escaped with other Indians engaged the Spaniards by force of arms, but with such ill success that abundance of them lost their lives in the attempt. After this they returned to Guatemala, where they built a city, which God in his judgment, with 3 deluges, the first of water, the second of earth, the third of stones, as big as half a score oxen, all concurring at one and the same time, laid level with its own ashes. Now all being slain who were capable of bearing arms against them, the rest were enslaved, paying so much per head for men and women as a ransom, for they use no other servitude here. And then they were sent into Pecusium to be sold, by which means, together with their slaughters committed upon the inhabitants, they destroyed and made a desert of this kingdom, which in breadth as well as length contains 100 miles, and with his associates and brethren in iniquity, 4 millions at least, in 15 or 16 years, that is, from 1524 to 1540, were murdered, and daily continues destroying the small residue of that people with his cruelties and brutishness. It was the usual custom of this tyrant, when he made war with any city or province, to take along with him as many of those Indians he had subjugated as he could, that they might fight with their countrymen. And when he had in his army 20 or sometimes 30,000 of them, and could not afford them sustenance, he permitted them to feed on the flesh of other Indians taken prisoners in war, and so kept a shambles of man's flesh in his army, suffered children to be killed and roasted before his face. They butchered the men for their feet and hands only, for these members were accounted by them dainties, most delicious food. He, as the death of many by the intolerable labor of carrying ships by land, causing them to transport those vessels with anchors of a vast weight from the Septentrional to the Mediterranean Sea, which are 130 miles distant, as also abundance of great guns of the largest fort, which they carried on their bare naked shoulders, so that, oppressed with many great and ponderous burthens, I say no more than what I saw, they died by the way. He separated and divided families, forcing married men from their wives, and maids from their parents, which he bestowed upon his mariners and soldiers, to gratify their burning lust. All his ships he freighted with Indians, where hunger and thirst discharged them of their servitude and his cruelty by a welcome death. He had 2 companies of soldiers, who hacked and tore them in pieces, like thunder from heaven, speedily. Oh, how many parents has he robbed of their children, how many wives of their husbands, and children of their parents, how many adulteries, rapes, and what libidinous acts hath he been guilty of, how many hath he enslaved and oppressed with insufferable anguish and unspeakable calamities, how many tears, sighs, and groans hath he occasioned, to how many has he been the author of desolation during their peregrination in this, and of damnation in the world to come, not only to Indians, whose number is numberless, but even to Spaniards themselves, by whose help and assistance he committed such detestable butcheries and flagitious crimes. I supplicate Almighty God that he would please to have mercy on his soul, and require no other satisfaction than the violent death which turned him out of this world. End of section 10. Section 11 of A Brief Account of the Destruction of the Indies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arnie Horton. A Brief Account of the Destruction of the Indies by Bartolome de las Casas. Translator unknown. Section 11. A Farther Discourse of New Spain and some account of Panuco and Xalisco. After the perpetration of all the cruelties rehearsed in New Spain and other places, there came another rabid and cruel tyrant to Panuco, who acted the part of a bloody tragedian as well as the rest, and sent away many ships loaden with these barbarians to be sold for slaves, made this province almost a wilderness, and, which was deplorable, 800 Indians that had rational souls were given in exchange for a burthen-bearing beast, a mule or camel. Well, he was made governor of the city of Mexico and all New Spain, and with him many other tyrants had the office of auditors conferred upon them. Now they had already made such a progress toward the desolation of this region, that if the Franciscans had not vigorously opposed them, and that by the king's counsel, the best and greatest encourager of virtue, it had not speedily been prevented, that which happened to Hispaniola in 2 years had been the fate of Hispania Nova, namely to be unpeopled, deferred, and entombed in its own rules. A companion of this governor employed 8,000 Indians in erecting a wall to enclose his gardens, but they all died, having no supplies nor wages from him to support themselves, at whose death he was not in the least concerned. After the first captain before spoken of had absolutely prophiaged and ruined the Panuconians, 15,000 whereof perished by carrying their bag and baggage, at length he arrived at the province of Mahuacan, which is 40 miles journey from Mexico, and is fertile and populous. The king, to honor him in the rencounter, with a multitude of people marcheth toward him, from whom he had received 1,000 services and civilities very considerable, who gratefully requited him with captivity, because fame had noised it abroad that he was a most opulent prince in gold and silver, and to the end he might export from and purge him of his gold, he was cruciated with torments after this manner. His body was extended, hands bound to a post, and his feet put into a pair of stocks, they all the while applying burning coals to his feet at a tormenting distance, where a boy attended, who by little and little sprinkled them with oil, that his flesh might roast the better. Before him stood a wicked fellow, presenting a bow to his breast, charged with a mortal arrow, if let fly, behind him; another with dogs held in with chains, which he threatened to let loose at him, which if done, he had been torn to pieces in a moment. And with these kind of torments they racked him to extort a confession, where his treasures lay, till a Franciscan monk came and delivered him from his torments, but not from death, for he departed this miserable life not long after. And this was the severe fate of many caciques and Indian lords, who died with the same torments which they were exposed to by the Spaniards, in order to the engrossing of their gold and silver to themselves. At this very time a certain visitor of purses rather than souls happened to be here present, who, finding some Indian idols which were hid, for they were no better instructed in the knowledge of the true God by reason of the wicked documents and dealings of the Spaniards, detained grandees as slaves, till they had delivered him all their idols, for he fancied they were made of gold or silver, but his expectation being frustrated, he chastised them with no less cruelty than injustice, and that he might not depart bubbled out of all his hopes, constrained them to redeem their idols with money, that so they might, according to their custom, adore them. These are the fruits of the Spanish artifices and juggling tricks among the Indians, and thus they promoted the honor and worship of God. This tyrant from Mehuacam arrives at Xalisco, a country abounding with people very fruitful, and the glory of the Indians in this respect, that it had some towns 7 miles long, and among other barbarisms equal to what you have read, which they acted here, this is not to be forgotten, that women big with child were burthened with the luggage of wicked Christians, and being unable to go out their usual time, through extremity of toil and hunger, were necessitated to bring them forth in the highways, which was the death of many infants. At a certain time a profligate Christian attempted to devirginate a maid, but the mother being present resisted him, and endeavoring to free her from his intended rape, whereat the Spaniard enraged, cut off her hand with a short sword, and stabbed the Virgin in several places, till she expired, because she obstinately opposed and disappointed his inordinate appetite. In this kingdom of Xalisco, according to report, they burnt 800 towns to ashes, and for this reason the Indians, growing desperate, beholding the daily destruction of the remainders of their matchless cruelty, made an insurrection against the Spaniards, slew several of them justly and deservedly, and afterward fled to the insensible rocks and mountains, yet more tender and kind than the stony-hearted enemy, for sanctuary, where they were miserably massacred by those tyrants who succeeded, and there are now few or none of the inhabitants to be found. Thus the Spaniards, being blinded with the lustre of their gold, deserted by God, and given over to reprobate sense, not understanding, or at least not willing to do so, that the cause of the Indians is most just, as well by the law of nature as the divine and humane, they by force of arms, destroying them, hacking them in pieces, and turning them out of their own confines and dominions, nor considering how unjust those violences and tyrannies are wherewith they have afflicted these poor creatures, they still contrive to raise new wars against them. Nay, they conceive, and by word and writing testify, that those victories they had obtained against those innocents to their ruin are granted them by God himself, as if their unjust wars were promoted and managed by a just right and title to what they pretend, and with boasting joy return thanks to God for their tyranny, in imitation of those tyrants and robbers, of whom the prophet Zechariah, part of the 4th and 5th verses, feed the sheep of the slaughter, whose possessors slay them, and hold themselves not guilty, and they that sell them say, Blessed by the Lord, for ye are rich. End of section 11. Section 12 of a brief account of the destruction of the Indies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arnie Horton. A brief account of the destruction of the Indies by Bartolomé de las Casas. Translator unknown. Section 12 of the Kingdom of Yucatan. An impious wretch, by his fabulous stories and relations to the King of Spain, was made prefect of the Kingdom of Yucatan in the year of our Lord 1526, and the other tyrants to this very day have taken the same indirect measures to obtain offices and screw or wheedle themselves into public charges or employments. For this pretext and authority they had the greater opportunity to commit theft and rapine. This kingdom was very well peopled, and both for temperature of air and the plenty of food and fruits, in which respect it is more fertile than Mexico, but chiefly for honey and wax, it exceeds all the Indian countries that hath hitherto been discovered. It is 300 miles in compass. The inhabitants of this place do much excel all other Indians, either in polity or prudence, or in leading a regular life and morality, truly deserving to be instructed in the knowledge of the true God. Here the Spaniards might have erected many fair cities, and lived as it were in a garden of delights, if they had not, through covetousness,